My name is Daniel Harper. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe as steady, not loud, not flashy, the one who listens more than he speaks, the one who gets things done without needing credit for it. At work, I was often seen as reliable, someone you could hand a task to and forget about. Outside of work, friends would say I was grounded, practical, maybe even a little boring. No one ever accused me of being ambitious in a visible way, and that was fine. I wasn't chasing attention. I believed growth happened quietly, over time, if you showed up and did the work. This story isn't about a dramatic betrayal or a single explosive moment. It's about something much quieter, and I think more common. It's about being promised growth, being told you're valued, and then slowly realizing that the value others see in you is not the future you were promised, but the convenience you provide in the present. For a long time, I thought patience was maturity. I thought staying calm meant I was strong. I told myself that if I just kept delivering, someone would eventually notice the weight I was carrying. That's what this story traces. Not the moment everything broke, but the long stretch of time where nothing seemed wrong on the surface, even as something fundamental was shifting underneath. You won't hear shouting in this story. There's no revenge fantasy, no public humiliation, no dramatic gotcha moment. What happened unfolded slowly, almost politely. Decisions were made in silence. Consequences arrived without announcement. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, the outcome was already set. I'm telling this story not to paint myself as a hero or a victim. I made choices. I stayed longer than I should have. I accepted explanations that were convenient for others and costly for me. This is simply an honest account of how quiet people are sometimes mistaken for endless resources, and what happens when that misunderstanding goes uncorrected for too long. If you're listening to this because you've ever felt overlooked, or because responsibility kept increasing while recognition stayed exactly the same, then you'll probably recognize pieces of yourself along the way. Not in the big moments, but in the small ones people rarely talk about. Before we go any further, I want you to know this. This story isn't meant to encourage resentment. It's about clarity, about understanding the difference between growth and exploitation, and about what it means to choose yourself without burning everything down around you. Have you ever wondered whether staying quiet was protecting your peace, or slowly costing you something you couldn't get back? To understand how everything unfolded, you need to understand who I was to them before I ever questioned it myself. At the company, my title was Senior Operations Coordinator. On paper, that sounded solid, respectable, the kind of role that implied trust and experience. In reality, it meant I was the person who knew how things actually worked, not the strategy slides, not the vision decks, the real mechanics, who approved what, which processes were fragile, which deadlines were flexible only because I quietly absorbed the pressure. People didn't come to me with big ideas. They came to me with problems they didn't want escalating. If a system broke, I fixed it. If a handover was messy, I smoothed it out. If a manager overpromised to a client, I figured out how to make reality bend just enough to save face. I wasn't invisible in the sense that no one saw me. I was invisible in the way furniture is invisible. You notice it only when it's missing or in the way. Otherwise, it's just assumed to be there, doing its job. In meetings, I was the calm one. I didn't interrupt. I waited. When I spoke, it was usually to clarify, not to impress. People nodded when I talked. Sometimes they even said, "Good point, Daniel." And then the conversation moved on, often with someone else rephrasing what I just said, louder, with more confidence, as if it were new. I told myself that was fine. Influence didn't have to be loud. Competence spoke for itself. Or at least, that's what I believed then. My manager, let's call him Mark, often described me as dependable. That word came up a lot. Dependable, solid, rock. Once, during a performance review, he smiled and said, "Honestly, I don't worry when something's with you. I know it'll get done." At the time, I took that as praise. I didn't realize that being someone others don't worry about also means they don't think about your limits. When new responsibilities appeared, they drifted toward me naturally, not with announcements or promotions, just quiet reassignment. Can you also take a look at this? You're already close to it, so it makes sense. It'll just be temporary. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent when you don't resist it. Others on the team were more visible. They had clearer boundaries. Some pushed back openly. Some were better at talking about their workload in ways that sounded urgent, even when it wasn't. I watched them carefully, not with resentment, but with curiosity. How did they protect their time without being labeled difficult? I didn't ask that question out loud. I absorbed more instead. There was a subtle hierarchy I didn't fully recognize yet. The loudest weren't always the most capable, but they were the most protected. Their confidence acted like armor. My calm, on the other hand, made people assume capacity. And so, I became the safe choice. If something was risky, it came to me. If something required patience, it came to me. If something had already failed once, it came to me because Daniel will handle it properly. No one ever asked if I wanted to. Outside the company, if you'd asked me how work was going, I would have said, busy, but good. I believed that. I liked being useful. I liked knowing things others didn't. There was a quiet pride in being trusted, even if that trust was never formalized. But there was also something else, barely noticeable at first, a sense that my role was being defined for me, not by me. I wasn't seen as someone who needed growth. I was seen as someone who enabled it for others. And the strangest part is this: no one was cruel about it. There was no villain twirling a mustache, just a system that rewards those who ask loudly and leans on those who don't. I didn't feel wronged yet, just placed, like a piece on a board that hadn't been moved in a long time. Not because it wasn't valuable, but because it was already exactly where everyone expected it to be. At that stage, I still believed patience would be noticed, that staying composed was a long-term investment, that someone, eventually, would connect the dots between how much I carried and what I deserved next. I didn't know yet that being seen as reliable is often the first step toward being taken for granted, especially when you never remind people that you are choosing to stay. The first time something felt off, it was so minor I almost dismissed it out of habit. It happened during a routine one-on-one with Mark. Nothing dramatic, no raised voices, just a casual conversation at the end of a long week. We were going over quarterly goals, and I brought up growth. Not in an ambitious way, but carefully, like I always did. I said I'd been thinking about my trajectory. I enjoyed operations, but I was interested in expanding into process design, maybe even leading a small initiative. I'd noticed gaps, inefficiencies no one owned. I framed it as a way to help the team long term. Mark leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly. He didn't interrupt. That felt encouraging. Then he smiled and said, "I'm really glad you brought this up. You're exactly the kind of person we see growing here." That sentence stayed with me. He continued, "Right now, though, we really need you where you are. You're doing such a great job holding things together. But let's revisit this in the next cycle." It was reasonable, measured, sensible. I nodded. I agreed. I told him I understood. What I didn't notice at the time was how neatly the conversation ended there. No follow-up questions, no timeline, no suggestion of what I should prepare for the future role. Just reassurance and a soft closing of the door. A week later, a new project landed on my desk. It wasn't small. It involved coordinating across 3 departments, fixing a process that had been limping along for months, and managing expectations from people 2 levels above me. No title change, no discussion, just an email. "Mark suggested you'd be the best person to take this on." I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. Best person, not available person, not an interesting person, best. I told myself it was a sign of trust, proof that the growth conversation mattered. This was probably how it started. More responsibility first, recognition later. That logic made sense. It felt adult, earned. So I said yes. What I didn't say was, how does this connect to the growth we discussed? I didn't want to seem transactional. I didn't want to be the person who turned every contribution into a negotiation. The cut was small, barely visible, but it was there. As weeks passed, the pattern repeated. I'd mentioned development, learning, and next steps. The response was always positive, always supportive, always postponed. And each time, more work quietly followed. Not punishment, just gravity. Other people noticed, but not in the way you'd hope. One colleague joked, "Careful, if you're too good at fixing things, they'll never let you stop." We laughed. I laughed too. But that comment stayed with me longer than it should have. What struck me wasn't that more work was coming. Which work? Not the kind that led somewhere visible. Not projects that built a narrative. It was maintenance, containment, cleanup. The things that mattered deeply but looked like nothing from the outside. I started to realize that my growth conversation had been heard but translated. What I meant was, I want to evolve. What they heard was, He's stable enough to carry more. The first real sting came when someone else was announced as the lead on a new initiative I'd quietly helped shape. I'd shared ideas in passing, made suggestions, helped refine the framework, never claimed ownership. And when the announcement came, I felt a flicker of surprise, but not outrage. I told myself leadership needs visibility. Maybe they'd earned it. Still, something shifted inside me, not anger, just awareness. I began noticing how often reassurance replaced action, how often praise filled the space where opportunity should have been, how my calm acceptance made it easy for others to move on. The cut didn't bleed, it didn't scar, it didn't even hurt that much. But it marked the moment I first realized that being patient doesn't always mean you're being respected, and that sometimes what feels like encouragement is just a way to keep you exactly where you are. Once you notice a pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. At first, I tried to convince myself I was overthinking things, that not every delay was a dismissal, that not every added responsibility was a signal. I told myself this was just how organizations worked. Slow, imperfect, always asking more before giving anything back. And so I adjusted. When deadlines tightened, I absorbed them. When scope crept, I accommodated it. When others hesitated, I stepped in. What surprised me was how quickly this became normal, not just for them, but for me. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It arrives dressed as trust, as urgency, as we wouldn't ask anyone else. And when you accept it once, it recalibrates expectations quietly. Meetings changed in subtle ways. I was invited less often to planning discussions, and more often to execution follow-ups. Decisions would be made without me, and then I'd be looped in to help make it work. No one asked for my opinion on direction anymore. They asked for my help managing consequences. When I raised concerns, they were acknowledged politely and filed away. Good point, someone would say, and then continue, as if I hadn't spoken. I began choosing my words more carefully, trimming them down to avoid sounding resistant. I became fluent in soft language. I can try. I'll see what I can do. It might be tight, but we'll manage. Each phrase felt professional, reasonable, cooperative. Each one trained people to expect flexibility from me, and none from themselves. There was one moment that crystallized this shift. During a team meeting, a senior colleague openly challenged a timeline that leadership had set. He was firm, calm, but unyielding. He said the resources weren't there, and that committing would be irresponsible. The room went quiet. Then Mark nodded and said, "That's fair. Let's revisit the scope." Later that same meeting, someone asked if I could take on an additional reporting layer to support visibility. I hesitated for half a second, just long enough to feel it, and then said yes. No discussion, no negotiation, just acceptance. I realized something then. Pushback from some people was seen as leadership. From me, it would have been seen as friction. So I kept the peace. I told myself I was being strategic, that patience now would pay off later, that my consistency was being logged somewhere unseen. But what I was really doing was normalizing the imbalance. I stopped expecting follow-ups on growth conversations. I stopped mentioning timelines. I framed my aspirations as vague, distant things, someday, eventually, down the line. And in return, the workload became denser. There was no single breaking point, just a steady erosion of boundaries, a gradual shift from contributor to catch-all. The most unsettling part was how polite everyone remained. No one was rude, no one raised their voice, no one dismissed me outright. They just assumed. Assumed I'd stay late, assumed I'd fill gaps, assumed I'd care enough not to let things fail. And they were right. I cared too much to let things fall apart, too much to say no without a perfect reason, too much to risk being misunderstood. So I carried more. What I didn't realize then was that every time I rationalized staying quiet, I was teaching people how to treat me. That respect, when unclaimed, doesn't stay neutral, it gets reassigned. By the time I finally admitted to myself that something was wrong, the behavior felt established, expected, almost justified. I had become the solution to problems I didn't create, and the silence around that role felt less like professionalism and more like permission. Still, I stayed. Because leaving would have meant acknowledging that patience hadn't been a strategy after all. It had been avoidance, and I wasn't ready to face that yet. There's a moment when you stop asking why something is happening and start understanding what you represent. For me, that realization didn't come during a conflict or a failure. It came during a stretch of calm, when everything was technically working, and I was quietly exhausted. I looked at my calendar one evening and noticed how little of it belonged to me. Meetings are scheduled without checking, deadlines set without my input, tasks added with the assumption that I'd figure it out. That's when it clicked. I wasn't being prepared for growth. I was being positioned as infrastructure. Reliable, flexible, invisible. The role I'd been assigned wasn't written anywhere, but everyone understood it. I was the stabilizer, the buffer between ambition and reality, the person who made sure other people's promises didn't collapse under their own weight. And infrastructure doesn't get promoted, it gets maintained. Once I saw it that way, everything made sense. Why did my development conversations always end with appreciation instead of action? Why were new hires introduced as future leaders, while I was introduced as someone who knows everything? Why did my name come up in crisis meetings, but rarely in opportunity discussions? I wasn't being overlooked by accident. I was being relied on by design. The system worked because I worked. There was an unspoken expectation that I would absorb complexity so others could stay focused on visibility, that I would translate chaos into order without needing acknowledgement, that my reward was trust, not advancement. And the truth is, I had accepted that bargain without ever reading the fine print. I started noticing how people spoke about me when they thought I wasn't paying attention. Daniel will handle it. Let's ask Daniel, he'll know. We don't need to worry about that if Daniel's on it. No mention of whether I should handle it. Just certainty that I would. At first, that kind of reliance feels flattering. It gives you a sense of importance. But over time, it becomes a cage, because once you are essential in a specific way, people become invested in keeping you exactly there. Growth for you becomes risk for them. The most painful realization was this: no one was intentionally holding me back. They simply couldn't imagine the system without me in that role, and I had never given them a reason to. I thought about all the times I'd smooth things over instead of escalating. All the late nights that prevented visible failures, all the quiet fixes that made leadership look competent. Every time I protected the system, I protected the perception that everything was fine and that my role was sufficient as it was. That's when the promise of growth I'd been given finally revealed its shape. It wasn't a lie, it was a deferral with no expiration date. As long as I remained indispensable where I was, there would always be a reason to delay my next step. Not out of malice, but out of convenience. Understanding this didn't make me angry, it made me still. For the first time, I stopped asking what I needed to do to be seen as ready. Instead, I asked a different question. What would happen if I stopped making this so easy for everyone else? I didn't act on it yet. I didn't change my behavior, but something shifted internally. The role they had assigned me no longer felt like an identity. It felt like a choice I had been making unconsciously, and one I could, in theory, stop making. That was the quiet beginning, not of rebellion, of awareness. And once you see the role clearly, you can't unsee it. You just decide how long you're willing to keep playing it. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment where I walked out of a room and knew everything had changed. It was an ordinary Tuesday. I was sitting at my desk late in the afternoon, staring at a process document I'd updated for the third time that month. Each revision responded to a new constraint, another team's delay, another leadership decision made without context, another quick adjustment that landed squarely on me. As I typed, I felt something unfamiliar. Detachment. Not frustration, not anger, just a quiet distance from the work itself. I realized I was no longer thinking about how to solve the problem creatively. I was thinking about how predictable this cycle had become, how every solution I provided created the conditions for the next problem to be handed to me. That's when it hit me. Nothing was broken. This wasn't a phase. This was the system working exactly as intended, and I was a part of the system that ensured it never had to change. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the office. Most people had already left. The lights were dimmer. The space felt hollow in a way it usually didn't. For the first time, I noticed how often I was alone at the end of the day. Not because I was slower, but because I was carrying things no one else stayed late to finish. There was a moment, small, almost invisible, where I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding for years. If nothing changes, is this the version of my life I'm willing to keep repeating? Not forever, just indefinitely. The answer came without emotion. No. What surprised me wasn't the clarity, it was the calm that came with it. I didn't feel betrayed. I didn't feel wronged. I felt awake. For years, I had framed my silence as patience, my flexibility as professionalism, my endurance as strength. But sitting there, in that quiet office, I saw those traits differently. They weren't being rewarded. They were being used. Not maliciously, not consciously, but consistently. And consistency matters more than intent. That evening, I closed my laptop at a reasonable hour, not as a statement, just as a boundary. No one noticed. No one said anything. The world didn't end. That was important. On the way home, I didn't replay conversations in my head like I usually did. I didn't draft imaginary explanations. I didn't rehearse how I'd bring this up someday. Instead, I made a decision that felt almost boring in its simplicity. I would stop hoping the system would recognize me. Hope, I realized, had been keeping me passive. It allowed me to endure without acting, because acting would have meant admitting that no one was coming to change things for me. From that day on, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a shift. I didn't demand anything. I just stopped offering myself automatically. I began paying attention, not to how much I was doing, but to how much was being assumed. I listened differently in meetings. I noticed which tasks were framed as requests, and which were framed as expectations. And quietly, without resentment, I started choosing what I would and wouldn't carry. The shift wasn't visible, not yet. But internally, the role they had assigned me loosened its grip. I no longer saw it as an obligation. I saw it as a pattern, and patterns can be interrupted. That Tuesday didn't change my circumstances. It changed my posture. And sometimes, that's the only change that matters at first. Before that shift, my silence had been automatic, reflexive, a habit formed from years of choosing harmony over friction. Afterward, it became intentional. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't explain myself. I simply stopped filling every gap the moment it appeared. When someone said, "We'll need someone to take this on," I didn't volunteer immediately. I waited. Sometimes someone else stepped in. Sometimes the room went quiet. I let that quiet exist longer than was comfortable. At first, people interpreted my silence the way they always had, as calm compliance. They assumed I was thinking, that I'd speak up in a moment, that I'd say yes, like I usually did. Sometimes I did, but only when it aligned with what I wanted to be responsible for, not with what others wanted to offload. This subtle shift confused people. I could see it in the way conversation slowed when I didn't respond right away. In the slight recalibration, I asked questions instead of giving answers. What's the priority here? Who owns the outcome? What happens if we don't do this right now? These weren't confrontational questions. They were reasonable, professional, the kind of questions that should have been asked long before things landed on my desk. But because I hadn't asked them before, they felt disrupted. Silence, I learned, is only perceived as weakness when it's expected to be filled. When you stop filling it, it becomes a mirror. People start hearing their own assumptions. Still, most mistook my restraint for hesitation. I noticed how quickly others moved to fill the space with justifications. It's just temporary. We just need a quick fix. It shouldn't take too long. I didn't argue. I didn't agree. I took notes. At home, I began writing things down in that worn black notebook I'd carried for years. Not emotionally, factually. Who asked for what, when, how it was framed, what was promised, what actually happened. Not to build a case against anyone, just to see the pattern clearly without the fog of explanation. And the pattern was clear. Work expanded to meet my availability, not my role. Growth conversations recurred without resolution. Responsibility increased without authority. By staying calm and silent, I had allowed that imbalance to persist. By choosing when to be silent, I was finally seeing it for what it was. What struck me most was how little resistance I faced. No one challenged me, no one pulled me aside, no one asked if something was wrong. Because from the outside, nothing had changed. I was still professional, still helpful, still composed. I just wasn't automatic anymore. And automation is what the system had depended on. In meetings, others began stepping into the spaces I left open. Not confidently, awkwardly. They stumbled over details I used to manage quietly. Small cracks appeared, nothing catastrophic, just enough to be noticed. I didn't point them out, I let them exist. This wasn't punishment, it was reality, unbuffered. I realized then that my silence had never been the problem, my predictability had. Once that predictability disappeared, people had to pay attention to the work, to the process, to each other. And slowly, without any announcement, my silence stopped being interpreted as compliance. It became unreadable, and unreadable made people cautious. That was new. While things on the surface seemed unchanged, something else was happening quietly, something no one was watching closely enough to notice. I was preparing. Not in a dramatic way. There was no secret countdown, no hidden agenda, just a deliberate shift in how I used my attention. Instead of rushing to solve problems, I started studying them. I paid closer attention to where information flowed and where it stopped. Who made decisions and who dealt with the consequences? Which processes existed only because I kept them alive through personal effort rather than formal ownership? I noticed how often my name appeared in documentation I hadn't written, but had implicitly shaped. How many workflows relied on assumptions that only I understood. How many temporary fixes had become permanent structures with no one accountable for maintaining them. None of this was confidential. None of it was hidden. It was simply overlooked because it had always worked. I began documenting processes in a way I never had before, not step-by-step manuals, but maps, dependencies, failure points, decision gates. I didn't share these documents widely. I didn't announce them. I kept them organized, dated, and precise. That black leather notebook was no longer just a habit. It was a record. At the same time, I invested in myself quietly. I took evening courses in process architecture and operational risk. Nothing flashy, nothing that required approval. I learned the language leadership used when they talked about efficiency and scalability, not just execution. I started understanding how organizations protect certain roles and trap others. The difference wasn't talent, it was narrative. People who advanced didn't just do the work. They controlled the story around the work. They made their contributions visible at the right altitude. I hadn't been doing that. I'd been operating underground, where things stayed stable but unseen. So I stopped correcting others when they oversimplified what I did. I let their assumptions stand. If they thought something was easy, I let it remain easy for now. I also noticed something else. Because I was no longer absorbing everything automatically, small inefficiencies began to surface. Missed handoffs, conflicting instructions, minor delays. Nothing disastrous, just enough friction to reveal how much silent coordination I'd been providing. Still, no one connected it to me. They blamed timing, resources, external pressure. I watched without comment. This wasn't about letting things fail. It was about letting them be accurate. What they never noticed was that I wasn't withdrawing. I was repositioning. I began building a clearer picture of my actual leverage. Not power in the loud sense, not authority, but dependence. Certain teams relied on my understanding of how their work intersected. Certain leaders trusted outcomes without understanding the inputs. Certain timelines existed only because I quietly negotiated trade-offs no one else wanted to manage. This knowledge changed how I saw myself. I wasn't just a pair of hands. I was a point of convergence. And convergence points are dangerous to ignore. The irony is, the calmer I remained, the less attention I attracted. My lack of visible frustration reassured everyone that things were fine. No one suspected that I was making myself optional by choice. I wasn't planning an exit yet. I wasn't plotting a reveal. I was simply ensuring that if the moment came where I needed to choose myself, I would do so from clarity, not impulse. They thought my silence meant acceptance. They never noticed it meant observation. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no triumphant moment where everything clicked at once. It arrived quietly, in pieces, over several weeks, until one evening, the picture was complete enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was reviewing a routine request that had come in late that day. On the surface, it was nothing special. Another adjustment, another quick check before a deadline. But as I traced the request back through emails, approvals, and assumptions, something stood out. This entire chain depended on me, but nowhere was that dependence acknowledged. If I stepped away tomorrow, there would be no owner, no backup, no documented authority, just a collective belief that Daniel will sort it out. That's when I saw it clearly. My leverage wasn't positional, it wasn't political, it wasn't even about being irreplaceable in a dramatic sense. It was structural. I was holding together intersections that had never been formally designed to connect. I wasn't just executing processes, I was compensating for their absence. And because I did it quietly, leadership believed the system was sound. This wasn't something I could weaponize aggressively, even if I wanted to. That wasn't the point. What mattered was understanding that the value I provided wasn't being measured correctly because it lived in the gaps between roles. Once I understood that, my sense of urgency disappeared. There was nothing to rush toward, nothing to expose. Just clarity. I reviewed my notes, my maps, the dependencies I'd documented. I saw patterns I hadn't noticed before, how certain projects always looped back to me at critical moments, how certain teams deferred decisions because they assumed I'd absorb the complexity later. I also saw something else. The promises of growth I'd been given were incompatible with this setup. If I moved up, the system would feel it immediately, and because no one had planned for that, they had unconsciously resisted the idea by delaying, by praising, by assigning just one more thing. Not out of malice, out of self-preservation. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel calm. For the first time, I stopped wondering whether I was imagining things. I wasn't. The pattern was real, coherent, and explainable, and that meant I had options. Not reckless ones, not emotional ones. Measured ones. I didn't celebrate this insight. I didn't even feel relief. What I felt was responsibility to myself. Because once you see the truth of your position, staying purely out of habit becomes a choice, and choices carry weight. That night, I closed my notebook and didn't open it again for a few days. I let the understanding settle. I watched how people interacted with me now that I wasn't reflexively fixing everything. Nothing changed on the surface. But internally, the fog was gone. I knew exactly where I stood, and that knowledge, more than any title or promise, was the turning point. Once clarity arrives, indecision becomes impossible to justify. I didn't feel rushed, but I felt accountable to myself in a way I hadn't before. Knowing where I stood meant I could no longer pretend I was simply waiting for the right moment. The moment was already here, it just wasn't dramatic. I laid out my options carefully, not emotionally. The first option was to stay exactly as I was, but with awareness. Accept the role, stop hoping for growth, and treat the job as a stable exchange. Effort for compensation, no resentment, no expectation, just containment. That option was safe, but it came with a cost I could now see clearly. Erosion of energy, of ambition, of self-respect. Even if nothing felt wrong day to day, I knew I would be shrinking quietly over time. The second option was to confront the issue directly. Ask for clarity, demand timelines, push for formal recognition of responsibility and authority. On paper, this sounded reasonable, mature, professional, but I also understood the system well enough to know how this would likely play out. There would be meetings, empathy, reassurance, maybe even short-term concessions, and then, slowly, gravity would pull everything back to where it was. Because the system didn't need a conversation, it needed a redesign, and I wasn't in a position to redesign it from inside, at least not without becoming the problem. The third option was the one I hadn't allowed myself to fully consider until now. Withdrawal. Not sudden, not hostile, just a gradual reallocation of my energy, away from a role that required my invisibility to function. This didn't mean quitting immediately. It didn't mean burning bridges or exposing flaws. It meant choosing a path that was irreversible in the most ordinary way possible. I would stop anchoring myself to a structure that depended on my silence. I would make myself less central by design. I would prepare for a future that didn't require me to hold everything together just to be seen as valuable. This option didn't offer validation, it offered freedom. That was the one I chose, not because I was angry, but it was the only option that aligned with the clarity I now had. I decided I would not announce this choice. I wouldn't dramatize it. I wouldn't even share it with anyone at first. Instead, I would move in a way that made reversal unnecessary. I would reduce dependency by formalizing what could be formalized. I would stop filling gaps that weren't mine to fill. I would quietly position myself so that when the time came to step away, or step forward, it wouldn't destabilize me. What surprised me was how light the decision felt once it was made. No adrenaline, no fear. Just a steady sense of direction. I wasn't choosing against anyone, I was choosing for myself. And that distinction mattered more than I expected. Once the decision was made, the hardest part was resisting the urge to explain myself. Silence, I learned, is most powerful when it isn't used as a signal, only as a method. I didn't change my tone at work. I didn't become distant or cold. I showed up the same way I always had. Calm, professional, consistent. On the surface, nothing about me suggested a transition was underway. But underneath, everything was becoming deliberate. I started by tightening the edges of my role. When requests came in that were outside my scope, I didn't reject them outright. I asked for clarity, ownership, timelines. I redirected questions back to their source, not defensively, methodically. If this needs approval, who signs off? Is this a one-time support or an ongoing responsibility? Where should this live long-term? Each question returned weight to the system that had quietly placed it on me. I documented decisions in shared spaces instead of private threads. I followed up verbal agreements with written summaries. I made work visible, not to show off, but to remove ambiguity. At the same time, I stopped smoothing over inconsistencies. If a process broke because no one owned it, I didn't rush to fix it alone. I escalated it neutrally, not as a complaint, but as a fact. This step doesn't have a clear owner. This timeline assumes availability that hasn't been confirmed. This dependency hasn't been addressed. These statements didn't accuse, they revealed. What surprised me was how little resistance there was at first. People nodded, adjusted, moved on. They still didn't realize what was happening. Outside of work, I began repositioning quietly as well. I updated my credentials, reconnected with contacts I'd let go dormant, not to ask for anything, just to reestablish context. I invested time in understanding my market value without attaching my identity to the company's perception of me. That distinction was important. It grounded me. There were moments where old instincts flared, when I felt the pull to step in and rescue something unnecessarily. Each time I paused, I asked myself, is this my responsibility or my habit? That question changed everything. Weeks passed, then months. The system adjusted slowly, imperfectly. Small inefficiencies surfaced. Meetings ran longer. Decisions took more effort. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to feel. Still, no one connected it to me. From their perspective, I was still there, still dependable, still composed. They didn't see the space I was creating around myself. They didn't feel the shift in gravity yet, and that was exactly the point. Because true movement doesn't announce itself. It becomes undeniable only after it's already in motion. The consequences didn't arrive with noise. They arrived as an absence. At first, it showed up in small, almost forgettable ways. The meeting ran over because a detail hadn't been clarified in advance. An email chain grew longer because no one quite knew who should answer it. A decision was stalled because the trade-offs weren't obvious to anyone in the room. None of this was blamed on me. That's what made it interesting. People blamed timing. They blamed the workload. They blamed how busy things have been lately. The system searched for explanations everywhere except where the change had actually occurred. I watched it unfold quietly. Because I was still present, still professional. No one thought to question my role. They assumed I was still absorbing complexity somewhere in the background, even when I wasn't. But the system felt different. I noticed it in the way people hesitated more in meetings. In the way managers started double-checking assumptions they used to gloss over. In the way certain tasks were suddenly framed as bigger than expected. These weren't failures, they were revealed. The kind of friction that appears only when a hidden support is removed. One afternoon, a project review ran into trouble. A dependency had been missed. The timeline was at risk. People started scanning the room for a solution. Out of habit, several eyes landed on me. I met their gaze, calm, neutral. I didn't rush in. After a pause, someone asked, "Do you have any thoughts on this?" I did, but instead of offering the solution, I offered the structure. I think we need to clarify ownership before we decide on next steps. That was it. No fix, no workaround, just a return to fundamentals. The room adjusted, slowly, awkwardly, but they adjusted. Afterward, Mark pulled me aside. He didn't sound angry, he sounded uncertain. "Things feel a bit heavier lately," he said. "Not sure why." I nodded. There's been a lot of change. That was true, just not in the way he meant. What struck me was how the discomfort didn't lead to reflection. At least not yet. It led to strain. People worked harder, stayed later, tried to compensate. They didn't realize they were feeling the cost of an imbalance that had existed all along, one I had been quietly paying for. Now that I wasn't, the bill was circulating. Still, no one panicked. No one confronted me. The organization did what it always did when things became slightly harder. It pushed forward. But something had shifted irreversibly. The absence was now noticeable. And once something is noticed, it can't be unseen. Recognition didn't arrive as praise, it arrived as a concern. Not directed at me, directed at the system. The strain that had been building quietly was no longer ignorable. Projects were still moving, but with friction that felt new to the people experiencing it. What I had once absorbed invisibly was now being encountered directly, and it unsettled them. Meetings multiplied. Suddenly, there were check-ins for things that had never needed them before. Alignment sessions, clarification threads. Leadership started asking questions that sounded unfamiliar in their mouths. Why is this so complex? Has it always been this way? Where's the bottleneck? I listened. The irony was difficult to miss. The answers had always been there. They just hadn't mattered while someone else was quietly containing the consequences. At some point, someone connected the dots, not fully, but enough to notice a pattern. I started receiving invitations again, planning meetings, strategy discussions, conversations that hinted at reevaluation. Not because of appreciation, but because of discomfort. One afternoon, Mark scheduled a longer one-on-one than usual. He was careful with his words. I could tell he was trying to understand without admitting what he might already suspect. "You've been doing great work," he said, "as always, but I wanted to check in. Is everything okay?" It was a fair question, and it came too late. I didn't say no, I didn't say yes. I said, "What do you mean by okay?" He hesitated. "Things feel less smooth. We're noticing more friction, and you've always been someone we rely on to keep things moving." There it was. Not an apology, no recognition, just a quiet acknowledgement of dependence. I nodded slowly. "I've been focusing more on role clarity lately." That was all I offered. The conversation drifted toward possibilities, adjustments, future conversations, the kind of language that signals intent without commitment. Months earlier, that would have been enough to keep me anchored. Now it felt like a reaction, not a plan. I could sense the urgency underneath his calm, the desire to restore equilibrium, to put things back the way they were, without fully examining why they'd worked that way in the first place. And that's when I knew something important. Even if changes were offered now, even if titles, compensation, or recognition suddenly appeared, it wouldn't address the core issue. The system wanted my stability, not my growth. And any fix offered under pressure would be designed to retain me in function, not elevate me in truth. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindicated. I was simply done waiting. By the time they started asking the right questions, I had already answered them for myself. And once you reach that point, going back doesn't feel like forgiveness. It feels like forgetting. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost disappointingly calm. No raised voices, no accusations, just a quiet meeting, scheduled with polite urgency, in a glass-walled room that reflected more than it concealed. Mark was there. Someone from leadership joined us as well. The tone was respectful, measured, and carefully neutral. They thanked me first for my consistency, my professionalism, my institutional knowledge. I listened without reacting. Then they spoke about alignment, about future opportunities, about making sure I felt supported. It was all very reasonable. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't recount the history. I didn't list grievances. I didn't mention the promises that had faded into postponement. I spoke about structure. I explained calmly how my role had expanded over time without corresponding authority, how responsibilities had accumulated without a clear narrative of progression, how the organization had come to rely on informal solutions instead of designing formal ones. No blame, just observation. I could see it land, not as an attack, but as a mirror. They asked what I wanted. That question would have paralyzed me months ago. I would have softened my answer, made it flexible, left room for interpretation. This time, I didn't. I told them what growth meant to me now, and what it didn't. I wasn't interested in more responsibility without influence. I wasn't interested in being the safety net for systems that refused to evolve, and I wasn't willing to continue in a role that required my invisibility to function. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, just heavy. They responded with options, adjustments, pathways, all sincere, all carefully framed. I listened. I thanked them. And then I told them my decision. I would be transitioning out of the role. Not immediately, not disruptively, with professionalism and notice. I would support a clean handover. I would document what I could. I would not leave chaos behind me. But I would not stay. No anger entered the room, no defensiveness. Just a quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted. As the meeting ended, Mark looked at me differently, not with authority, but with something closer to respect. Not because I had demanded it, because I had removed myself from the role that made my silence convenient. I walked out of that room lighter than I expected, not triumphant, clear. Stepping away didn't feel like an escape, it felt like alignment. In the weeks after that meeting, I stayed true to what I'd said. I documented processes carefully. I answered questions without overfunctioning. I helped others understand the work without taking it back onto my shoulders. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't carrying more than I was meant to. What surprised me most was how my identity began to change, not externally, but internally. I stopped thinking of myself as the reliable one, or the person who holds everything together. Those labels had once felt like compliments. Now, I saw them as partial truths that had quietly limited me. Reliability is valuable, but it isn't a destiny. I began to notice how much mental space had been freed up. Evenings felt longer, decisions felt clearer. I wasn't rehearsing explanations in my head anymore. I wasn't anticipating needs that hadn't been voiced. I was responding, not preempting. In conversations with people outside that environment, I spoke differently, not with bitterness, but with precision. I understood my own value better because I'd seen what happened when it was withdrawn, not dramatically, just enough to be felt. I also understood something else. Walking away didn't make me stronger. Recognizing when to walk away did. There was no sense of victory, no moment where I felt proven right. Just a steady sense that I had honored myself without harming anyone else. And that mattered to me. I still believe in professionalism, in calm, in measured responses. I still value patience, but I no longer confuse patience with self-erasure. Who I am now is quieter in a different way, not the quiet of endurance, but the quiet of choice. I don't stay where growth is promised, but structurally impossible. I don't accept roles that depend on my silence to function, and I don't wait for systems to recognize me when I can recognize myself. That doesn't make me better than who I was before. It makes me whole. There's a version of the story that could have been louder, one where I stayed until resentment hardened, one where the conversation turned sharp, where blame was named, where doors closed instead of opening. But that's not what happened, and not what needed to happen. What I learned is simpler and harder than that. Most systems don't exploit people on purpose. They exploit patterns. If you are calm, capable, and accommodating, the system will lean on you, not because it's cruel, but because it can. And if you never interrupt that pattern, it will continue until something gives. In my case, what gave wasn't my temper or my ethics. It was my availability. I didn't punish anyone. I didn't expose failures. I didn't demand validation. I just stopped volunteering my silence as a substitute for structure. The promise of growth I was given wasn't false. It was incomplete. Growth requires space, authority, and intention. Without those, responsibility becomes a trap disguised as trust. Quiet people often believe that if they stay composed long enough, fairness will notice them. Sometimes it does, but often, fairness isn't watching, its only function is. The most important shift for me wasn't leaving a role, it was redefining what loyalty meant. I learned that loyalty to a system that cannot evolve is not integrity, it's inertia. And choosing yourself doesn't require anger, it requires clarity. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. If your workload keeps growing, but your influence doesn't, that's not a phase, it's a signal. You don't have to explode to be heard, you don't have to burn bridges to move on, and you don't have to wait for permission to stop shrinking. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is step back quietly and let the system feel what your silence was carrying all along. If you've ever been promised growth while being handed more weight instead, how did you respond, and what would you do differently now?
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.